This is the PowerPoint for Chapter 6 of our textbook, Homicide Victimization. So defining homicide is defined as a general term referring to the killing of one human being by another. And there's 3 types of homicide, which we're going to talk about here in a second. The first being excusable homicide, second being justifiable homicide, and the third, criminal homicide, which includes murder and also manslaughter. So first we're going to talk about excusable homicide. So this is basically a complete accidental or unintentional killing, and we do not count these as homicides when we're collecting our crime statistics. So recent example of some excusable homicide that happened, Alec Baldwin in 2021 was filming a movie and shot at what he thought was a prop gun on the movie set. It turns out, for whatever reason, it was a real gun and it was loaded, and he ended up killing Helena Hutchins, who was working on the movie set. So the case is still ongoing, but we don't know if he's going to be criminally charged, but they're saying that probably not, and instead it's going to be found as an excusable homicide. So the next type is a justifiable homicide. So this happens when you're defending either your life or your property. So the FBI defines it as the killing of a felon by a peace officer in the line of duty, or the killing during the commission of a felony of a felon by a private citizen. So some examples of these include stand your ground laws. So this is when an individual can use force when they're defending themselves, and they're not required to retreat beforehand. These can be used regardless of where the event occurs, whether it occurs in your own house or outside of your own house. Some states have stand your ground laws, some do not. But it has been linked to an increase of homicides, of these justifiable homicides. The Castle Doctrine, there's no duty to retreat again, but this only can happen on your private property. So states without these laws require you to flee to safety before using force, but if in states that have the Castle Doctrine, you do not have to flee to safety first, and you can use force to defend yourself or your property on your own private property. So one example of a justifiable homicide, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin shot and killed by George Zimmerman in Florida. He was simply walking home from a convenience store. George Zimmerman thought that he looked out of place, thought that he was committing a felony, which he was not, and ended up shooting and killing him. At first, they kind of wanted to sweep it under the rug a little bit, but finally, due to protests, Zimmerman was arrested, and he used the stand your ground defense, and he ended up being acquitted, and they called it a justifiable homicide. But most people consider this to be a gross miscarriage of justice. So the next type is criminal homicide. So this is the purposeful, knowing, reckless, or negligent killing of one human being by another. There's 4 subtypes of criminal homicide: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, felony murder, and manslaughter. So first we're going to talk about first-degree murder. So this is murder committed with deliberate premeditation and malice. So there's 3 elements. Premeditation means that the act was considered beforehand, so it's not a spur of the moment thing. This is something that was thought out and planned. And deliberation, the end was again planned with careful thought, not on an impulse. And it has to have malice. So this has to be intentional death, whether that be express malice or actual malice or implied malice. So this is when the death occurs due to gross negligence rather than intent. So this means that you're taking a disregard for human life. Okay, so one example that we're going to be used of first-degree murder, and as of a few days ago, July 2020, when this is filmed, this was overturned, but we're still going to talk about it for first-degree murder because it's a good example of implied malice. So Justin Harris convicted of first-degree murder after leaving his 2-year-old son in the hot car for 7 hours. So it wasn't like he, actively killed his son. using his hands or using his weapons, but he had implied malice, meaning that he acted very, very negligently and left his son in the car, which he, knew was going to be too hot for him. It was, July in Atlanta, I believe they lived in Atlanta. So prosecutors argued that he left his child in the car in order to kill him to be relieved of his parental responsibilities. He received life without parole, but of July 2022, the conviction was overturned because some of the evidence used, I guess they weren't allowed to use that particular evidence during the trial. Okay, so next is second-degree murder. This is murder committed with malice, so you're intending to kill someone, but without premeditation and without deliberation. So these are, in other words, offender intended to cause harm, but it was not pre-planned. So these are generally crimes of passion. So a good example of this, the husband comes home early, finds his wife is having an affair, he grabs a handgun from the closet and shoots and kills both of them. So this was not something that he was, planning on doing when he woke up in the morning, but it just, crime of passion, emotion took over, impulse took over, and he ended up killing them. He meant to kill them, but he did not plan it beforehand. So a lot of these second-degree murders are as a result of a disagreement. So an example of this is the killing of George Floyd, killed by police officer Derek Chauvin. He suspected, Floyd used a counterfeit bill, and while he had him in police custody, Chauvin kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes and killed him. And in 2022, he was convicted of second-degree murder. So he didn't, necessarily wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to kill George Floyd, but it's something that he meant to do, but he didn't pre-plan it beforehand. And Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. So generally, the second-degree murder sentences are a little less severe than the first-degree murder sentences. Okay, the next type is felony murder. So this is often unintentional killing during the commission of another felony. So if someone is committing a bank robbery, a kidnapping, a sexual assault, or whatever other crime that's considered a felony, and then ends up killing somebody while they're committing those crimes, it is considered a felony murder. So you don't have to necessarily have the intent to kill someone or murder someone, but you do have to have the intent to commit the other felony. These are usually considered first-degree murder. So for an example, maybe somebody is robbing a bank, which is a felony. They hit somebody in the head, maybe with their gun or something, and they end up dying. That would be considered a felony murder. So an example of felony murder is Ahmaud Arbery. 3 men, I believe they're former police officers, chased an unarmed man through the neighborhood. Arbery was jogging around his neighborhood, and there was some, construction going on, so he was kind of peeking in the homes that were under construction, and these men thought that, well, who knows what they thought, but they ended up killing him. So 2 of the men were found guilty of felony murder, and it qualified for felony murder because of the way that they used their pickup truck. They were kind of chasing him and cornering him, which was considered aggravating assault, and false imprisonment because they detained him before they shot him. So they were convicted of felony murder. Okay, so next is manslaughter. So this is also an unlawful killing, but the degree of responsibility is less for that of murder. So for example, voluntary manslaughter, you mean to inflict injury on somebody, but you do not mean to kill them. So for example, using excessive force in self-defense. And then there's involuntary and negligent manslaughter, that you do not mean to, even hurt somebody or kill somebody, but their death results from gross negligence. So ignoring the possible danger or potential harm to other people. So a good example of involuntary manslaughter is killing somebody when you're driving drunk. You're not, trying to kill somebody, but being behind the wheel while you're drunk is considered gross negligence because you're not taking people's, the potential harm into account when you are committing this act. So an example here of voluntary manslaughter, this is Luis Campos. He was just sort of standing in line waiting to get in a bar in Vegas, and another guy came up behind him and for whatever reason, sucker punched him in the back of the head. Luis fell and ended up hitting his head and ended up dying. So he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. James Beach wasn't necessarily going, looking to kill Luis, but he was intending to inflict harm. And when he did inflict harm, he did end up killing him. So involuntary manslaughter. An example of this is the parents of 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley. Ethan Crumbley ended up killing 4 kids at his high school, and the gun was bought by his parents. Ethan had was showing some signs that he could be violent. He had some very severe mental health issues, and the parents totally disregarded that, bought him a gun for Christmas, didn't, lock it up properly. So they were charged with involuntary manslaughter. The trial has not happened yet. It will happen, I believe they're saying like October 2022. So we'll see if they get a conviction from that. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about specific types of homicide victimization. So the first is filicide. So this is a killing of a child by a parent or caretaker. So something that's not super common, but when it does happen, it often receives a lot of media attention. So a case that's been in the news a lot recently is Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. And they're charged with the murder of Lori's children, Tylee and JJ. So this is Tylee and JJ. They were reported missing by their grandparents, and Lori and Chad went off to, Hawaii, and people thought this was really weird that if their children are missing, why are they, going on vacation? They ended up looking at Chad Daybell's property and found the children's remains. Lori claims they were believed to be possessed by the devil. So again, something that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it receives a lot of media attention. Okay, infanticide, this is a homicide of a parent of a child as well, but the victim is under 1 year of age, so it's a type of filicide. The younger the child is, the more at risk they are to be murdered by their parents. So infants from birth to age 1 actually have a very high risk of being murdered compared to older children or teenagers even. So this is Brooke Skylar Richardson. She was a teenage girl, ended up getting pregnant, didn't tell anybody, delivered a baby in her bathroom in her parents' house and buried it in her backyard. Baby died. She claims that the baby was stillborn, but they were able to look at it and determine that it was not born stillborn. It was alive, and she did end up killing it. She was charged with the murder, but she ended up being acquitted of this. Again, infanticide is not something that is super common, and when it does happen, it does receive a lot of media attention. Okay, parricide. So this is a murder of one's parents. It includes patricide and matricide, so mother and father. A really famous case of this is Lyle and Eric Menendez in the 1980s. They shot their sleeping parents in the back of the head. They weren't immediately suspects. The Menendez family was very, very well off, and Eric and Lyle had everything that they could have wanted, but they spent a lot. It was found out that they did this more as for financial reasons, and this is a common reason in parricide, is that the children want to get at their parents' money. But the way they acted after the murders, they went on this lavish spending spree, and eventually they're found to be suspects. At trial, they claimed they were abused by their parents in the childhood. There wasn't any, signs of that, so who knows if that happened, but they did end up being convicted of first-degree murder, and they are sentenced to life without parole. Okay, eldercide. This is a type of homicide that involves a victim who is 65 years of age or older. So this is not common at all, again. Only 5% of homicide victims are over the age of 65, so it's not very common at all. And when it does happen, it does, receive a lot of attention. And often the reason for this is also financial as well, is a common motive for elder side. So an example is Dorothy Puente. I believe this was in the 80s, yes, 82 to 88. She ran a boarding house for elderly people, and she would collect on their social security checks. So these are people that were kind of, maybe drifters, maybe didn't have a lot of family that was checking up on them. And she murdered 9 of these senior citizens and buried them in her backyard and collected on the social security checks. Okay, so intimate partner homicide. This is a type of homicide that is more common. This involves spouses, ex-spouses, people in relationships, or partners of same-sex relationships. So about 13% of homicides were committed by an intimate partner. This is sometimes followed by the suicide of the offender as well. So a lot of murder-suicides are with intimate partners. So an example is Susan Powell. She was murdered by her husband, who then killed their 2 sons and himself. So killed his wife first. I think he buried her somewhere in the desert in Utah. And then when they started to close in on him and figure out that he was the one who did this, he shot his 2 kids and then shot himself. Okay, so another type of homicide is honor killings. So these are usually associated with Middle Eastern and South Asian cultures, and it's usually against a female victim by their male family members as a way of regaining their honor. So this usually happens if either the female, doesn't want to enter arranged marriage, maybe if she gets divorced, maybe if she commits adultery. So an example of this, they do still happen here in America. An example of this in America is Noor al-Maleki. She did not want to go back to Iraq and marry her cousin. I believe she had another boyfriend here in the States. And she was run over by her dad in his car. Her father was found guilty of second-degree murder. Okay, so now we're going to talk about homicides that have multiple victims. So the first is serial murder, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. This is a murder of 3 or more individuals with a cooling off period in between. So something that is not super common anymore, probably due to the fact that, we have better ways of identifying people that would be serial murderers before they are able to kill more than one victim. Better policing with DNA. This has probably been the reason that there is not as many serial murders as there were in, say, 60s, 70s, 80s. The motive is usually psychological gratification. It can be financial, but normally it's simply because the person enjoys killing people. They get off on killing people. So usually they follow the same pattern or modus operandi. So they'll usually go for similar victims. They'll usually sort of find their victims in similar ways and kill them in similar ways as well. So one of our most famous serial murderers, Ted Bundy, he confessed to killing 30 women between 1974 and 1978, but the number is thought to be much higher than that. Okay, next is mass murder. Unfortunately, this is something that we have experienced a lot in this country over, the past couple decades. And this is 4 or more victims murdered in the same location with no cooling off period in between. This includes all, our recent mass murders with school shootings and, grocery store killings and movie theater killings. And the motivation usually isn't that the person, enjoys killing, but it's usually revenge, that they want attention and notoriety, political ideology. The difference with serial murders is that the serial murder will go out of their way to try not to be detected, whereas the mass murderer knows that they're going to end their crime either being killed themselves or spending, the rest of their life in prison. So most offenders do end up shooting themselves or getting killed by the cops during the event. So like the motivations for, say, the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007, the offender simply wanted to have a higher body count than the Columbine shooters. They just want that notoriety. Okay, so the last type of homicide with a multiple victim is a spree murder. So this is a killing of multiple people at 2 or more locations with no break. So in 2011, Scottsdale, Arizona, Dwight Jones kills 6 people in 2 different locations. So first he goes to his forensic psychiatrist, Stephen Pitts, kills him at his office, goes to another location and kills several paralegals that are involved with his divorce and custody hearings, and then goes to another location and kills several of his friends. So he ends up committing suicide, which is common with spree murders. Often the spree murders sort of have, a bone to pick with the people that have wronged them, and they will pick specific people in order to, take them out. And they also know that they're either going to commit suicide, get shot by the police, or end up spending the rest of their lives in prison. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how homicide is measured. So obviously we can't use victimization surveys to measure homicide because the victims are simply not around to, talk about their victimization. So we did use the UCR, but as of 2021, we have switched to NIBRS. So this is reported by the individual police departments. And it does include sort of information about the offender, the victim, the weapon used, and sort of the relationship and the circumstances around the event. Before that, and you'll notice our textbook still talks about it, we did use the UCR supplemental homicide reports. Again, we're not using the UCR anymore. And for the homicide rate for 2021, we have no idea. So like I said in a previous previous PowerPoint, we don't know in 2021 what crime looks like. The switch over from the UCR to the NIBRS was, still ongoing. We don't have proper data. Police departments aren't participating. So we have no idea what this looks like. So we also measure homicide using the National Center for Health Statistics. And this is mortality data that's collected since the early 1930s. So not just homicides, but all types of mortality. And this is not collected by police officers, but it's collected by coroners and medical examiners when they're doing the death certificates, and they just, forward the information to the National Center for Health Statistics. So again, all types of death are recorded. There's specific codes for homicides. Okay, so again, 2021, we're not really too sure how much homicide took place. We do have some statistics for 2020, and it looks like between 2019 and 2020, the homicide rate did rise. So again, we're not too sure what this looks like now. Was this simply a little, bump due to COVID? Are we on an upward transition again? We do not know. So homicide sort of reached its peak in the early 90s, sort of the height of the crack epidemic. But it really dropped off in the late 90s to 2000s, was kind of going down ever since. Now we do see, a little uptick again. Again, we don't know if this is something that's going to continue. We're not really sure why it rose. Probably has to do with COVID. So people are lost their jobs, they're stressed out, they're in close quarters with each other. And, when people snap, sometimes this ends in a homicide. When children are not in school, or were not in school in 2020, so there was no one to intervene in cases of child abuse. So teachers are reporters of child abuse, and when they weren't seeing their students, sometimes the child abuse kept getting worse and worse and worse, and ended in an act of homicide. Again, there's less police officers in the street because people are sick with COVID. Maybe that had something to do with it. We're not too sure. Okay, and homicides rates do vary state by state in the United States. So generally, the southern states have the highest rates of violent crime, including homicide, compared to, the northern states, northeast, northwest, the Midwest. The South is usually has the highest homicide rates. Why? Well, there's higher income inequality. Whenever you have high income inequality, you have more of all types of crime. We have less spending on public health and education, more firearms, and just, the Southern culture of, defending your honor. So globally, we have several ways that we collect homicide data. The UN, the WHO, Small Arms Survey. Generally, the USA has a high homicide rate compared to other developed nations. So compared to Western Europe, compared to Japan, Australia, Canada, United States has a higher homicide rate. However, Latin and South America probably has the highest homicide rates, about 30 per 100K. Southern Africa as well, Russia as well. So still higher homicide rates than the United States. Western Europe and Japan have the lowest, less than 1 per 100K. And we'll talk a little bit about the reasons about why this is when we talk about international perspectives in a later chapter. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some risk factors and characteristics of homicide victimization. Again, like most types of crime, victims are most likely to be young, so 18 to 24, and it follows the offender curve, so those that are most likely to be involved in offending are the most likely to be at risk for homicide victimization. Infants, like I said, were also at higher risk. So birth to age 1, you're at sort of a high risk of homicide, and then in your late teens to early 20s. Okay, so males are overwhelmingly more likely to be victims of homicide, but of course that depends on the type of homicide. They're about 4 times more likely to be murdered than females. Transgender and gender nonconforming individuals are also at a high risk of homicide, and 2021 was the deadliest year for transgender homicide. Again, intimate partner homicides are more likely to be experienced by females, but all other types of homicides are more likely to happen to males. Okay, so race and ethnicity, it's an overwhelmingly intra-racial event, so people killing people of their own race rather than other races. Homicide rates are slightly higher for blacks than they are for whites. Stranger killings are more likely among white women than black women, so black women are more likely to be killed by someone they know than a stranger. Okay, so the relationships between offender and victim. So most homicides involve people who know each other. It's serial murder, mass murder, something that you would be more likely to kill someone unknown to you, but generally people know each other. So about 30% of female homicide victims are killed by a romantic partner, and only about 3% of male homicide victims are killed by a romantic partner. So mostly it's people that you're acquaintance with, either friend, romantic partner, family member, etc. Okay, so geographical area also matters for homicide victimization, and we see a little map of Lubbock here. Red means more crime, green means less crime. So urban areas are more likely to have homicide, private dwellings rather than public places, and in low socioeconomic status areas. With substance use, murderers and the victim are likely to have consumed alcohol, drugs, or both. So lastly, we're going to talk about some consequences of homicide. So bereavement, this is a state of being sad after an individual you have cared for has passed. This is something that is experienced as a form of secondary victimization, so something that doesn't happen to the victim themselves, but the people around them. So someone that is in a state of bereavement might have anxiety, anger, guilt, flashbacks, and nightmares. Additional stressors on the family is, death or casualty notifications. Family members being notified of their loved ones passing is obviously very hard on people. And then Re-involvement in the criminal justice system is hard as well, especially if they have a lack of closure in homicides. So homicides that are not solved are very, very, very difficult on the family members and the people that cared about them. Okay, so some responses to homicide. So there's police responses. An example of this is Operation Ceasefire. So this was a program put in place in Boston in the 1990s to address gun-related gang violence. It focused on these severe sanctions. So they used deterrence theory, saying that, if we catch you involved in gang-related violence, we're going to lock you up and throw away the key. They just wanted to use something called pulling levers. So they let these gang members know that violence was not going to be tolerated. It wasn't really effective. It did get some guns off the streets, but it was not necessarily effective at reducing homicide because the severity of sanctions probably didn't matter to these people. So it didn't matter that they were going to receive a more severe sanction. They were going to, be involved with this gang activity no matter what the sanctions were. So court responses have been a little bit more effective at reducing homicide. So one, Project Exile, this focused on an increase in sentences for firearm-related offenses. Again, it wasn't super effective, but it might have helped a little bit. But Operation Hardcore, this one was more effective. So this is where gang-related cases were prosecuted through a special unit. Community responses, there's fatality reviews. So this is where sort of people get together, the community, police officers, etc., and review the circumstances surrounding a homicide to kind of get a better understanding on why it happened and how they could prevent similar experiences in the future. This is usually done with juvenile homicides and domestic violence. There's mediation that is sometimes done between the offender and the victim's family. Of course, this is if the victim chooses to go through with this. Not all victims want to do this. And then hospital-based programs. So this teaches victims of violence how to prevent re-victimization. Like we, talked about in earlier PowerPoints, not necessarily super effective.